This is the Let's Go Win podcast with your host, J.M. Ryerson.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Let's Go Win podcast. You are in for a treat today. Dr. Fleet Maull is an author and renowned growth mindset and meditation teacher around the world, both in person and online through Heart Mind Institute. He's an executive coach, inspirational speaker, and social entrepreneur. Fleet founded the Prison Mindfulness Institute and National Prison Hospice Association, catalyzing two national movements while serving a 14-year mandatory minimum federal drug sentence, 1985 to 1999. Dr. Maull developed the radical responsibility empowerment model that embraces 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face, free of blaming oneself or others. Dr. Maull, it sounds like you've been awfully busy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure. I mean, as I said before, I think you just have an interesting backstory, and obviously mindset and meditation is something we love talking about. But how did you get into this work? Maybe a 2 to 5 minute version of your story to really diving in to the work that you do currently today.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned, I spent 14 years in federal prison on drug charges, and that's something I'm not at all proud of, but I am proud about what I did with my time there and what's come out of that. But I was one of the baby boomers that came up through the 60s, came of age in the 60s, and classic angry young man, and graduated from high school in 68 and alienated and angry. And I just went headlong into the counterculture of that time. And, went to college majoring basically in drug, sex, and rock and roll and anti-war politics and all the rest of it. And, I was always a spiritual seeker, but I got caught up in all this other stuff too. So I had this kind of bifurcated life between that ongoing search and then all the attendant craziness and the rest of it. And I eventually wanted to really just get away from it, especially the whole drug culture was kind of getting darker, moving from that initial psychedelic era into kind of a darker era. And I just wanted to get out. And also when Nixon was reelected to his second term, I just had kind of had it. And so I started traveling in Latin America. Started off in Mexico, went all through Central America, ended up in South America. I had a goal of getting to Peru. I'm not even sure why. I was looking for something real, and I always had this idea I'd encounter something real and magical there, and I did actually. It was a phenomenal place that I still have a relationship with. So, so I became an expat living down there, and was really, doing a lot of trekking and exploring the indigenous cultures and the archaeology and it wasn't really about drugs, but I hadn't overcome my drug problems, and there was still a bit of a dabbling in drugs and so forth, but that wasn't really the emphasis. But at some point, I fell into small scale drug smuggling as a way to just continue my expat lifestyle, and I justified it with this us versus them thinking, the whole world was hypocritical, and I just had all these internal justifications, and and I never really tried to get rich at it. I just did it enough to kind of live outside the system. And then at some point, I've been trying for a long time. I kind of figured out in high school I was a Buddhist. I was raised Roman Catholic, and today I'm a lover of all the great religious and spiritual traditions. But back then, pre-Vatican II Catholicism didn't sit too well with me, and I probably didn't sit too well with it. Really in high school, reading some different things, I kind of figured out I was a Buddhist, but there weren't a lot of others around with similar interests. And it was really traveling Latin America that I started to meet, people with shared interest. And so I was trying to practice on my own, reading a lot of books, and then I, kind of one step forward, three steps back, trying to figure it out. And then I read about the founding of then Naropa Institute, now Naropa University, by the Tibetan meditation master Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in 1974. I was living way up high in the mountains of the Andes Mountains of Peru, in a very remote valley, and some travelers would, different times travelers would find their way up to our place, and so some folks came by and they had a copy of Rolling Stone magazine, either late summer or early fall of 1974, and it had this big feature spread about the founding of Naropa Institute, which was a huge spiritual happening. They expected a few hundred people to the inaugural summer sessions. They ended up getting like 1,500 to each of 2 summer sessions. And it was a huge happening. And a lot of the really well-known names in Western spirituality and meditation and Buddhism today were all there, at least the older ones, right? And anyway, I read about that and I knew I had to go there. And I saw Trungpa Rinpoche's name and that just kind of grabbed me. I knew somehow there was just some recognition. So it took me a while. I got up there right away and checked it out, but it took me a while to enroll. In the meantime, my son was born. His mom was from Peru. He was born in the U.S., but I eventually enrolled and got my master's degree in what was then called Buddhist and Western psychology. It's now called contemplative psychotherapy. And that was between 77 and 79. But I still had this, shadow life. I disappear once or twice a year and go do a smuggling run. It's the way I was continuing to kind of live outside the system and not deal with reality like ordinary folks. And so that continued, but I got very deeply involved in the Buddhist path and with Trungpa Rinpoche as my teacher. And I kept this other thing secret from him and the community. And so that kind of went along for a while. And there was obviously clearly internal a lack of there was cognitive dissonance, extreme cognitive dissonance about that world, those 2 different worlds of mine. And I just self-medicated to deal with that. And eventually I did get out, but other people I'd been involved with decided to invite me along when they got busted. And so eventually I was indicted. And because of my Buddhist values, I didn't want to testify against anyone because, I just couldn't see someone else is going to do my time or someone else is going to go to jail. Their family's going to suffer instead of me. It wasn't that I was trying to be a stand-up guy. It's just that didn't square with my Buddhist values. So anyway, I ended up, lots of other people were willing to testify. And so I became the designated kingpin. And I ended up doing a lot of people's time. But nonetheless, I earned my way into that situation. So I went to prison in 1985, and that ended up becoming an incredibly transformative journey for me. And I always point out the fact that for most people, it's not. Most people come out of prison worse than they went in. They come out angry, bitter, traumatized, damaged in many cases. Many people don't survive prison. I was very fortunate that I went in with a lot of resources and a lot of training already and a lot of resilience. So it was a very painful, difficult journey. The most painful part was not being with my son. He was 9 years old when I went to prison. And the fact of what I'd done to my son and that he was going to grow up without his dad, let alone what I'd done to my family and my son's mom and my community and to myself, I basically kind of torched my own life. But really, more than anything else, what I'd done to my son, I was just devastated by all that. It was a dark night of the soul, and I became radically dedicated to get all the negativity out of my life and to let the good things I'd received from my family and my spiritual teachers to blossom in ways that could do some good. I wanted to really show up and create a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison, or even maybe that his dad died in prison, because I had no surety that I'd survive. Initially, I was sentenced to 30 years with no parole. And I thought that meant 30, but the paper the next day, I was 35. The paper the next day said I'd be 65 before I had any chance of release. Once I got in, and it took a while, I kind of figured out that under the old law prior to 1987, you got a lot of good time. And so I realized I would serve 18 and a half years, which still felt like forever. And then on my appeal, which took 3 years to go through the courts, they knocked off 1 count, reduced my sentence to 25. And on that, I had to serve 14 and a half, which I did if I stayed out of trouble. If I gotten in trouble, they can take all that good time away from me and you do all your time. But anyway, I ended up serving 14 years and really focused on transforming my own life.
Well, the word radical definitely comes into mind. There's a few things floating through my head. The fact that so often you see people choose to either be a victim or choose to be responsible. So the name of your book is absolutely, I haven't had a chance to read it. I look forward to it, but radical responsibility. You took responsibility for your actions and others and chose to make it an incredible, not maybe as you said, I can't imagine how challenging that would be being away from my son, that would be awful, but you chose to do something positive from that. Can you talk to me about radical responsibility? Because that seems so, the title is absolutely perfect for the way you approach life.
Yeah, absolutely. It was born of my experience there in prison. So I usually describe radical responsibility as voluntarily embracing 100% responsibility or ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life, which includes all those circumstances that, if we get honest, we can see we did have some part in, either causing, or we contributed something, or we just allowed it to happen, or what have you. But even those circumstances that we can't see we had anything to do with, the ones that seemingly just land on our head, and everyone would agree that we had nothing to do with it, and maybe it's a terrible injustice, we even embrace those. Why? Because it's the only place we actually have any real power, is when we take ownership for things. And I'll go a little more deeply into that. But one of the core distinctions is between ownership and blame. So radical responsibility, I would say, has nothing to do with blaming others, but also has nothing to do with blaming ourselves, not even one iota, and it has nothing to do with blaming victims at all. So when we look into circumstances that we find ourselves in, and we're trying to understand those circumstances, the reason we would look to see if there's any way we have a relationship to it, did I contribute to it, did I cause it, did I allow it, was I unconsciously promoting it based on internal life scripts from my childhood or something? The only reason we look into that is because what we can learn there can help us make different choices in the future. It's just a process of learning. If I can see how I got to some outcome I'm not so happy about, then the next time I can make different decisions that'll lead to different outcomes. And then if we can't see we had anything to do with it, well, we're still at a choice point, right? We're always at choice points. And our destiny is really going to be determined by the choices we make. And so, can we find the most creative way we can respond to any circumstance, even in our own enlightened self-interest, which usually ends up being in the interest of others as well. And, to choose to empower ourselves, to focus on what can I do? What can I do in the face of a circumstance that may be incredibly unjust, right? So in prison, the way that I really kind of that arose for me. I mean, as I said, I was lucky. I came into prison already with a lot of positive influences and a lot of training. And when I got there, I saw that it was an incredibly negative world, and just all my fellow prisoners had some kind of victim story for the most part, and a lot of them had been terribly victimized as children, and a lot of them were overly over prosecuted. There were probably very few who were literally innocent, but nonetheless, that was, when you get arrested and you go through any kind of criminal justice proceedings, and much less getting convicted and going to prison, from the very beginning of being booked into a jail somewhere, it's just this process of shaming and demonization. You're just being buried under a mountain of shame and demonization and so forth. So naturally, as human beings, we try to protect ourselves from that. And usually we armor up with bitterness and anger and our own victim story. And, in prison, early on when I got to the federal prison, which was a relief because I'd spent 7 months in a hellhole of a little county jail, a steel and concrete little tank. So this was at least a big place, and I could get a job, and they had a place to work out in a yard you could walk on and so forth. So, but when I got there, well, there were two things that happened. The first thing that really happened was I saw what an incredible place of suffering this was. I mean, when I got there, I was pretty wrapped up in the drama of my own situation, right? I just received a 30-year no parole sentence, and I thought that meant I was doing all of that time. And so I get there, and this is the maximum security federal prison hospital, the maximum security hospital for the federal system. And I get there, and right away, I'm seeing men being wheeled around in wheelchairs, paraplegics, quadriplegics. I'm seeing, people from the psych ward doing the Thorazine two-step down the hall. I'm seeing people who are blind being, assisted down a hallway. Can you imagine being in a maximum security prison and being blind? I mean, I was just seeing such suffering. It was like something out of a Fellini movie. And so that really woke me up. It woke me out of the drama of my own situation and all the positive influences of my life, where then, it was really kind of choiceless to how can I show up here? I've got a lot of training. How can I show up and be helpful? And then the other part was, as I was mentioning, the initial ritual when you met a fellow prisoner, you go out for a walk on the yard or something after lunch or something, and they tell you their victim story, then you tell them your victim story. You know how your lawyer screwed you over, your ball partner screwed you over, and you go through the whole litany. And after a couple of those, I certainly didn't want to hear my story anymore, and I really didn't want to hear their stories, which is not very compassionate. But that's just not where I wanted to live. Fortunately, I'd had enough background that I knew I definitely, if I could survive prison, I didn't want to come out angry and bitter with a victim mindset, but I didn't even want to live that way while I was there. And so I realized that the only way I was going to be able to work with my situation in there and not end up that way was to take absolute 100%, 200% ownership for having got myself into that place and what I was going to do with it and whether I would get out, what my life would be like post prison. So that's really where I just made a decision to embrace that. And it actually seemed like the most sensible thing to do. And it was really from that place of radical responsibility that I ended up being able to create all the programs I created there and the organizations that came out of that, and everything that's unfolded in my life for the last, I don't know how long I've been out now, since 22 years, for the last 22 years came out of that.
Well, it's remarkable. And I love hearing when people do come out better from a obviously, traumatic experience. And my question would be, because I am a big proponent of meditation, we talk about it frequently on this show, and we won't spend all that much more time talking about you being in prison, but I'm curious, you have the time to meditate, but being safe is also a part of meditation and being able to really lose yourself. How was that for you in that space? Because obviously you teach this. It's been a huge part of your life and upbringing. So how was that in that space to try and find yourself or be able to have some mindful moments and really some meditative moments?
Yeah, well, meditation was the bedrock of my life there in prison. Absolutely. When I got there, I realized, well, two things. One, I realized that a big thing that had been missing in my Buddhist path was focusing on the ethical principles of that path and the precept practices, which are all about not doing harm, right? And clearly, being involved in drug smuggling is a violation of the Buddhist precepts. And so had to reckon with that. And I decided to make the precepts, the basic lay precepts of not causing harm, not killing, not stealing, not lying, not misusing on intoxicants or using them at all in that situation. And I took vows of celibacy. The lay vow is a vow of not engaging in sexual misconduct. But I became a monk, actually received ordination, novice ordination, and dedicated myself to celibacy in that environment. But most principles, I wanted to ground my life there in these ethical principles and these precept practices. And then the other thing was, I realized that any good I was going to be able to do there, any positive influence I was going to have there for anyone, was really going to come out of my practice. So I dedicated myself to really practicing like my hair was on fire. So I was practicing hours every day and more on weekends. And I would get up very early in the morning and practice. And well, initially I was in these big dormitories. A lot of people in prison are not in cells, they're in big dormitories. And in this place, you started off in like a 28, 24-man dormitory with bunk beds, and you start up on the top bunk. And, if you stay out of trouble through seniority, you work your way to better and better living situations, right? So I went from one of those big dorms to like an 18-man dorm to a 12-man dorm to an 8-man dorm to a 6-man dorm. And I finally got into one of the few single cells. They're really more like rooms. The doors don't lock, but it has a door and a window that the guards can see through. And but I finally got that about 2.5 years into my time, and I was lucky enough to keep it the rest of the time, because you can lose it over really silly stuff. And but initially I was practicing sitting on the upper bunk. So then I decided to start using the trash closets, and I would go in and clean it out and put the trash brooms and things outside so people had access to them. And I'd take a folding chair and sit in there. And in the summer it was like sitting in a sauna. But I was just absolutely dedicated to make, intensive practice the bedrock of my life. And so I really focused on that, and really I was right. Everything that I was able to do in prison kind of did come out of that. And I probably avoided, you know, I stumbled into about a half dozen situations, encounters or conflicts during my 14 years there that could have gotten very violent, and one that nearly did. And fortunately, I was able to manage those situations without getting hurt or hurting somebody else. But I probably avoided thousands, tens of thousands of situations like that, because, the living conditions were so overcrowded. I lived on a floor that was originally designed as a hospital ward for 50 patients. And we had 185 guys on that floor, and no air conditioning in the summer. So there was always somebody in your way. You're always bumped. There was just a fight or conflict waiting around every corner. And there were lots of people got into lots of fights and lots of conflicts, and people were killed while I was there. It was a federal prison hospital, so people were dying a lot, but people were also killed violently. And and so, my awareness practice allowed me to avoid 98% of that, or 99% of that. And I was also really able to deepen. I was very fortunate in my Tibetan Buddhist path to have received empowerments, and I received more while I was there because teachers came to see me to do these deep inner yogic practices that are deeply transformative. And, within 3 to 4 years into my prison sentence, I was really living in a very clear, cheerful state all the time, even though I was surrounded by all this craziness. And you're confronted with incredibly dehumanizing encounters with your fellow prisoners and the correctional officers. I mean, on a good day, that might only happen 6 or 7 times. I mean, just being treated or interacted with in incredibly demeaning, dehumanizing ways. And, I was able to work with that and not get so hooked or triggered by that because really of the clarity of mind and the resilience of mind that came through all that meditation and mind training practice.
Yeah, and obviously you're ahead of the game in terms of the Western side of the world. You really adopted this practice earlier than so many people have started to in the Western part of the world. My question would be, and maybe you just have some advice, those that aren't still in for meditation clearly has benefits. Scientifically, it's proven. They've shown so many benefits. What would be, you said the word layman, let's use some layman terms. What would be your best advice to someone to say, this is why meditation could really affect your life in a positive manner? Do you have some advice to that?
Sure. Meditation or various mindfulness practices, um, you know, they operate at every level. So it can be simply a tool for better managing our stress and better dealing with life. And it's also these same practices lead to the most profound states of consciousness and states of awareness that human beings can experience. They lead to a path of ultimate liberation and becoming really completely spiritually and psychologically free. And so, but they're good at every level, right? Good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good at the end. I mean, it's all good. And I would say for someone new or just thinking of how could mindfulness practice or meditation help my life, it really comes down to self-regulation, to our ability to regulate our own physiology. And thereby we're able to regulate our own emotions and our own behaviors, which puts us in the driver's seat of our own life, puts us in what I call self-leadership position in our own life. And if we don't take ownership for regulating our own physiology, our own autonomic nervous system, then guess who is regulating it? Everybody but us, the world around us. And we're just kind of getting bounced around in there, living in the interface between our childhood conditioning, which we had nothing to say about, but which is very much programmed into our brain, changeable, but we need to do that work to change it. But we live in the interface between that and the world around us, and that's not such a good ride all the time. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can become conscious and start learning to self-regulate. And it is so simple to learn simple mindfulness-based self-regulation practice, breathing practices. And I mean, it's just so simple. And also, developing some self-reflective capacity that to kind of become aware that we do have this thing called awareness. We have this capacity to be aware and to be aware that we have lots of thoughts going on and we have emotions going on and we have different sense perceptions going on. There's what's going on in the world around. And we have a lot more awareness about that. And from that place of awareness, then we can choose how to respond to it and we can learn from it. Because when we don't have that, we're just in it. We're like a fish in the water. That analogy, are fish aware of the water because they're just kind of in it. But with various meditation and mindfulness practices, it's like we step out of the water and we're sitting on the bank, and now we can observe everything about the river and the water and the hydrodynamics, and from that place we have choices. So develop some kind of self-reflective capacity and awareness uh, sets us up to have choice in life. And then there's very simple practices we can learn to when we find ourselves all upregulated to bring ourselves back down into a more resilient zone. Or if we find ourselves shutting down and getting too down-regulated, we can bring ourselves back up. And how to be in that zone, which Dan Siegel called the window of tolerance. I like to call it the zone of resilience, where we can respond to life from our best self with our best resources, rather than just being caught in habitual reactivity in the way we engage with life.
Yeah, guys, there's not just one way to do it. He's made that sound so simple. It's just have some observance, be able to respond and not just react. I love that. You also talk a lot about growth mindset for optimal human performance and personal evolution. I'm a huge fan of growth mindset. It's something that I apply in all my businesses. Where did that really come from for you, the growth mindset, and really adopting this mindset in everyday life so
Mhm.
that we can optimize our human performance?
Well, fortunately, I think I always had a growth mindset orientation. I don't know how genetically or experiencing up through my family, but certainly once I began studying Buddhism and other contemplative traditions, and the influence of my teacher Trungpa Rinpoche, who was this great Tibetan meditation master, but you also could have called him a growth mindset teacher. Um, so really, for a long time now, the work that was done, I'm trying to remember. I need to memorize these names. I mean, the name part of my brain's a little dysfunctional, but it's a woman academic professor who really has popularized that distinction between growth mindset and fixed mindset, and really, especially in the field of education. They've done a lot of research that that children in early childhood education, as well as through high school and then young people in university, do phenomenally better if they have a growth mindset rather than a limited mindset. And of course, very simply, a limited mindset means that we think that the way we are is the way we are. Like, this is just how I am. This is my personality. It's not going to change. I have these talents. I don't have those talents. I'm this smart. I'm that, whatever. I mean, we're just fixed. Like, this is just the way I am. And when, you hear people say it all the time, well, that's just the way I am. I can't do anything about that. That's just the way I am. That's the way I feel about these things. Or, we identify with all our likes and dislikes, which are it's all just conditioning. We think I'm a chocolate ice cream person. I would never eat strawberry, right? It's just conditioning. And we identify with all that stuff. And we often think that's just the way we are. So that's a limited, fixed mindset. And then a growth mindset is realizing it's all changeable. We can grow and evolve. The brain, based on what we know about neuroplasticity today, the brain is continually changing, and we can make it more plastic through exercise and mind training like mindfulness, and we can move it into a direction of becoming both more complex and better integrated. So it's just a higher performing machine sitting there on our shoulders and more useful. And we can grow in every dimension of our lives. We can grow in our relationships. We can grow in our spiritual life. We can grow in our financial life. We can grow in every aspect of our life, and there's really no limitations on it. There's absolutely no limitations on it. And so that's the growth mindset. And it's a very different place to live from, obviously. And radical responsibility is another version of that. Radical responsibility is a specific version of the growth mindset that's really about leveraging that kind of radical ownership. And, it has some relationship to stoicism, to that kind of philosophy. But one important thing that I always like to bring forward is, because I talk a lot about transforming the victim mindset, not getting caught in victim mindsets. I don't in any way mean to be dismissive of the fact that people are victimized in life. People are victimized in terrible, horrific ways. And when they are, they may need tremendous support and validation. And it's certainly not for me. And I don't feel for anyone else to go tell them, you need to get off your victim mindset now. That would be terrible. Right. So, this conversation is really about ourselves, not about applying it to others. And it's also about adults, not children. Children deserve to be protected and are brought into different levels of accountability, different ages and different societies. But this is really about ourselves as adults and what's actually in our own enlightened self-interest. And it's not in our interest to stay stuck in a victim mind. It may be very understandable. I mean, such horrible things happen to people. When they're able to transform that, it can be almost miraculous, but people do. And people have been transforming the most horrific conditions forever. I mean, Viktor Frankl's book about his time at Auschwitz, the most infamous death camp in the Nazi Holocaust, where I go every year. I am one of the leaders of a bearing witness retreat. We go there to bear witness to the realities of what we're capable as humanity in order to transform that and prevent future violence and genocides and the like. And it's an incredibly transformative thing to go there. And we do it. We're there for a whole week in retreat. And but Viktor Frankl talked about, even in the worst circumstances one could ever imagine being in, his whole family was wiped out into the gas chambers. He's in the work camp. People around him are just dying, dropping like flies of starvation, the cold, just emaciated, stripped of even a shred of human dignity. So you're in that situation. Maybe even a guard has a gun pointed at you, and you don't really even have a choice about whether you're going to live or die. But he said, we have a choice that no one can ever take away from us. And that choice is the attitude that we bring to that situation, right? And that can be a hard one choice, because if we've chosen anger and bitterness and fear our whole life, it's going to be hard to shift that when push comes to shove. But we can, people have, and they do all the time. So it's that kind of notion of ownership. So I don't mean to be in any way dismissive about the things that happen to people. And also, ideally, the radical responsibility model ultimately is the integration of both personal and collective responsibility. And my second book is going to be about the collective part. The first book mostly focuses on personal responsibility, not entirely, but mostly focuses on personal responsibility because I feel that's where you have to start. You can't you can't have people, we can't go out and create collective responsibility from a place of personal irresponsibility, right? It takes people who embrace personal responsibility can then create collective responsibility. And unfortunately, we have there's a lot of push out there for collective responsibility without the personal responsibility. And in fact, that's that whole argument with the left and right politically all the time. Neither side wants to give an each inch, and obviously it's both. We need both personal responsibility and collective responsibility. We want to make the we want to make the playing field of life as fair as we can possibly make it, right? You can never guarantee equal outcomes because that the only way you could ever even try to do that is through some kind of tyranny. It's never worked anyway. But we can try to create equal opportunity for everyone, and that's a goal we'll be we're never going to be perfect, but we should be trying to do that, in every way we can in our entire life to make sure everybody has equal opportunities. And so that's a tremendous goal to aspire to, and taking collective responsibility for that is really important. But it's got to be grounded in taking personal responsibility and then influencing others to do so instead of influencing others to have a victim mindset, which often happens with people who are wanting to change the world and turning the world into victims and oppressors. And we want to it's just like reinforcing people's victim mindset, which doesn't actually help them change.
So, guys, you're going to have to rewind that because there was so much good stuff in there. So, Man's Search for Meaning is the book by Viktor Frankl that he's talking about. It is literally a life altering book. You have to check it out if you haven't had the chance. And then he was talking about Mindset by Carol Dweck. She absolutely
Carol
brought it to
Dweck.
the
Yeah. Thank you
forefront.
for remembering her name.
Yeah, she brought it to the forefront of education and the world in general, just to say, this is what this is called: fixed mindset versus growth mindset. I want to get into mindful leadership. And you talk about how leading organizational change and transformation. Tell me what that means with mindful leadership, because I think I know, but I really want to get that definition from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one way to think about it is, what do we want from our leaders, right? What do we want from our leaders? Well, we want them to have integrity, right? We want them to be honest and have integrity. And we want them to be available. We want them to be really present. We want them to care and be relational. And we want them to have the emotional intelligence to navigate their own emotional life skillfully, and then also be empathic with others, right? And so doing all that requires awareness practice. And the way that I teach mindfulness meditation and awareness meditations, I teach it in a very deeply embodied way. I have a model called Neurosomatic Mindfulness, and it's neuroscience informed and a deeply embodied approach to practice. Because first of all, just by really landing in our body, really, and developing a deep physical felt presence of the body, is very helpful to mindfulness practice, because it's like putting lead in your butt, right? It grounds you, right? It's more difficult for the mind to wander, easier for it to come back. And also, the more deeply our awareness goes into the body, we naturally are then more aware emotionally. And we realize that we have many layers of feeling, mood, emotional tone going on all the time, all the time. And even when we're kind of triggered, we feel an intense emotion. We might just think I'm angry or I'm fearful. There's usually actually 15, 20 different emotions going on in any situation like that. So by living more in our body instead of just up in our head, by living more in our body, we're in tune with all that. And that deepens over time, and we become more and more emotionally intelligent. So what we're activating there is something called interoception, which is just short for internal perception, or interoceptive awareness, which is the body's capacity to feel itself from the inside out, because the whole body is sensory, all the way down to the bones and including the bones, all living tissue, all containing neuronal cells connected to the central nervous system. And we're all familiar with interoception because it's how we know when we're hungry or tired or thirsty or need to use the restroom and so forth. And it's how we experience pain. But we generally ignore the internal landscape of the body, except when there is discomfort. I have a friend that he was quoting another friend that said, in Western culture, we've gotten to the point where we regard our body as nothing more than a brain taxi, just something to carry the brain around, right? And we have these amazing brains that incredibly creative cognitive capacities, but untethered from the body and the heart and the earth, we're creating a lot of destruction, right? And that's not to demonize our creative capacities, is we need to reconnect our amazing brains with our heart, with our body, and with the earth. And so the more we become embodied, we gain access to a much deeper self-understanding, emotional intelligence. It also, we know from current neuroscience that enhanced interoceptive awareness heals trauma, increases resilience, increases measurable, testable emotional intelligence. And it just, really puts us more in the driver's seat of our own life, to be there and be there in an effective, empathic, relational way. So, that's the training for mindful leaders, to be able to do their own work so they can show up in ways that are relational, empathic, and helpful, and that they don't have to, they don't have to be locked into leadership positions either. They lead when it's called for, and they follow when it's called for, and they partner when it's called for, and they collaborate when it's called for, right? But it has to do with developing that self-reflective capacity and becoming an embodied person who's connected with our heart, that's not just living up in the head, and who really operates more from the heart center, really. I mean, the head's really important, but it really needs to be in service of the heart and in service of our empathic connection with ourselves and others. So that's really what we mean by mindful leadership. I have a whole course on mindful leadership where we go through 7 steps, but I kind of generally, in a finger painting kind of way, covered most of it there.
Well, I like how, like you said, it's not just your body's not just a brain taxi. That I've never heard that one. That's pretty good. But even the Heart Mind Institute, what you're saying is it requires both. You need to be vulnerable and have the emotional intelligence to really show up for those that you are leading, or for your group, or for your team, or for your family. So important. Um, what I know, you mentioned prior to us coming on air that you have some programs that you ran very successfully. You have another one coming up, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about that?
Yeah, all the criminal justice and prison work we do it through our nonprofits: Prison Mindfulness Institute, Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, Engage Mindfulness Institute, so forth, which is all one part of one nonprofit. But then I have Heart Mind Institute, where I offer lots of online programming and live programming. When we get beyond the pandemic, I'll go back to doing some live retreats, but a lot of online courses, like in radical responsibility, mindful leadership, and other things. And then last year we started putting on virtual summits. We did our first Global Resilience Summit last May in 2020. We had 32,000 people enroll, and an array of incredible global experts and change agents. We had 47 speakers. It was really phenomenally successful. We just completed another summit where we had 51,000 people in attendance, called The Best Year of Your Life, a 10-day summit back in January, helping people launch the new year and really, keep evolving towards our best self in the different domains of our life, right? Our health and well-being, our relationships, our spiritual life, our financial health, our business interest, our career, whatever, all these different areas of our life. And so our next summit coming up is the second annual Global Resilience Summit, and it'll go live May 24th through May 29th, 6-day summit. And these summits are free, and there's 7 or 8 speakers every day, and you get free access to that for 48 hours of each day speakers, and it runs from the 24th. Actually, the last day, viewing day, will be on the 30th of May. And then if people want, they can also get access to what we call the lifetime access package, where they can have all that content to enjoy at their own pace. But we have an incredible lineup of presenters from around the world who are really global change agents. And this year we have one day completely focused on climate change and the climate crisis. But the summit focuses on developing our individual resilience. The second day is on healing trauma and resilient relationships. The third day is on creating communities of resilience and a culture and a society of resilience, and dealing with all the social justice issues we need to become more resilient. Then a day on climate change, then a day on systemic resilience. How do we create resilient systems? And then finally, we have a day focused on listening to the earth and native voices. And we have 7 incredible indigenous speakers from different indigenous backgrounds. And it's so wonderful to hear them, because I mean, they have such a natural connection with the earth, and such a natural connection with the heart. and they're able to communicate that in a loving, non-shaming way. I mean, I just feel so grateful for being in touch with the different indigenous leaders that I'm in touch with these days, because they just their voice is just it just rings so true, and it's never coming across in that shaming way like you all are not. It's just inviting us into changing our relationship with the earth and how we're living on the earth in a really loving way.
Well, it sounds awesome. You guys make sure to check it out. We'll link it in the show notes. You have the book, Radical Responsibility. You guys check that out. I know when you said you had another book coming. Do you know the date that that's really going to be released? Or are you still working on that right now?
I'm still working on that. I don't have a release date for that. I did just release a second book, but it's more in the criminal justice space. It's called Mindfulness-Based Wellness and Resiliency, and it's for public safety professionals, police, corrections, probation and parole, all forms of law enforcement. But it really would be the book could apply to anybody. What's in the book, and especially we're also doing a lot of training these days with frontline healthcare workers using the very same model. But anyway, that book is just coming out this month. But the second book on radical responsibility, the collective part of it, I hope to get it out probably next year.
Now the world will be a better place once you do it. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you're like, darn it, JM, I got to say this to the audience? I want to give you that open forum before we tell them how to connect with you.
Well, we're living through really, really challenging times. I mean, I think I don't even think I don't think any of us can really realize how challenging these times are. We'd have to somehow step out of it and have some distance from it to see that these last 14, 15 months since the pandemic began have just been off the charts crazy. I mean, I lived through 1968, one of the most tumultuous years in U.S. history with Martin Luther King's assassination and Bobby Kennedy's assassination and the Kent State killings. And, I mean, that was the year I graduated from high school. But, I'm not even sure if that compares to what we've just been through. I mean, the pandemic, which is not over at all. And then we had this incredible reckoning with race and social justice and all the persistent inequities in our society that followed, in particular the George Floyd tragic killing, police killing, as well as Breonna Taylor, and which was just many, in a long line of these tragic mistakes by police, whether they're driven. I think a lot of them, are mistakes, and that's why we're training police in mindfulness. But a lot of them are some of them may be influenced by implicit bias or actual racism, but they're horrible tragedies. And so we're, all the protests that came about after that, the Black Lives Matter movement. And then, one of the things that troubles me is that all this has kind of pushed the one thing off the front part of the radar screen is the climate emergency we're in, because, who would have thought that in our lifetime we'd be looking at the fact that humanity is facing an actual existential threat. This planet could become uninhabitable for human beings, if not in our lifetime, in our children's lifetime, and certainly in our grandchildren's lifetime. And so, if we don't start doing something about this soon, we're in trouble. And the reason I'm talking about all this is resilience is just so important. We need to become more resilient so we can not get, because when we're not resilient, when our zone of resilience gets smaller, which it does, trauma impacts all of us, and it tends to shrink our window of tolerance, our zone of resilience, and we become more reactive, and we tend to either shut down, disassociate, avoid things, and go into unhealthy coping mechanisms, or we get all agitated and act out in unhelpful ways, right? And that leads to conflict and can lead to violence. So we need to all become more resilient so we can stay in that window of tolerance or zone of resilience, even with the really challenging stuff, and find a way to come together and develop the shared consensus and will to do the things we need to do to really change the way we're living on this earth, and also to survive and not go into chaos when things do get rougher, because we may be headed for some severe disruptions. And if we don't have the resilience to stay together and form communities and work with each other, it's going to end up in chaos. So anyway, I guess that's just I think we all have to take ownership for doing anything we can become the more resilient. You can't do it overnight, but just start taking steps every day to take better care of ourselves physically, make sure we drink enough water, learn to breathe properly, develop some kind of mindfulness or self-awareness practice, right? Just start doing better self-care to begin with, maintain really good relationships, keep the health of our relationships alive, all these things that help us, live in a more resilient way, because then we're going to make better decisions and we're going to be able to come together and do the things we need to do to pass this amazing earth on to our children, our grandchildren, great grandchildren, and so that there's a future for humanity and all of our fellow species on this planet.
Yeah, we got some work to do, but we can all do it. We start with ourselves, and then, like you said, the next book, collectively working together, it makes a ton of sense. Dr. Maull, where can our listeners connect with you online?
Well, they can go to my basic website, which is fleetmaull.com, just fleetmaull.com. Heart Mind Institute, where I offer a lot of my online programming and the summits and courses, is heartmindinstitute.co, not com, but .co, heartmindinstitute.co. And then on the around the criminal justice and prison work, if they're interested in that, all the work we do with at-risk incarcerated returning adults and youth is prisonmindfulness.org. The work we're doing with public safety professionals is mindfulpublicsafety.org. And then we do bearing witness work and also train mindfulness teachers in trauma-informed approaches to teaching mindfulness through engagemindfulness.org.
Lots of places to find him, you guys. He is busy. He's providing so much value to the earth, to everybody in general. Dr. Maull, I so appreciate your time. Amazing. I have a ton of notes myself. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. And also just to remind people, the Global Resilience Summit coming up in May, that's just globalresiliencesummit.org. So yeah, it was my pleasure, Jam, and I'm really appreciate the invitation and appreciate the opportunity to connect with your audience.
Truly our pleasure, Dr. Maull. You guys, I hope you got as much out of that as I did. I mean, he talks about things I'm passionate about: growth mindset, mindfulness, meditation, so many of these practices. You hear it over and over. Don't be afraid. Just dive in a little bit. I promise you the rewards are great. Until next week, you guys go to Amazon, Champions Daily Playbook. It's available to you. I really think you'll get some value from it. It's a short read, and then it's practical things that do talk about taking care of the mind, the body, and the soul. As you guys know, it's so important to me. Until next week, continue transcendent life. Have a great one. Thank you so much for listening. If this content is delivering value to you, please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review us. That helps us build this community, and that is what we are all about. Building this community as big as we can, helping as many people as we can, and deliver as much value as possible. Be sure to head over to letsgowinpodcast.com for information on my coaching courses, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Let's Go Win 365. Let's go win and transcend in life.
This is the Let's Go Win podcast with your host, J.M. Ryerson.